The winter of 1899 had settled heavily upon Chicago, turning the city into a place of long shadows and brittle silence. On nights when the lake winds howled, the cobblestone streets felt deserted, lit only by gas lamps that flickered in the frost. Smoke from factories clung to the sky like a ceiling, and the Chicago River, frozen in patches, sent up a pale mist that rolled through the alleys. It was on one such night, bitter and wind-scoured, that a discovery would shake the city to its core. A watchman named Thomas Leary, doing his usual patrol along the warehouse district near Clark Street, carried his lantern low as he checked for broken locks and wandering vagrants. At first he thought the shape he saw lying near the mouth of an alley was nothing more than discarded fabric or a drunk sleeping off a long night, but when the lantern light reached the figure, the truth made his hand tremble. It was the body of a young woman. Her skin was chalk white against the blackness of the bricks, her eyes frozen wide open as if caught in mid-surprise. Around her neck was a scarf, pulled so tightly it had left deep grooves in her flesh. What unsettled Leary even more was the silence. There were no signs of a struggle. Her gloves were still on, her small handbag still clutched in one hand. A few snowflakes had gathered on her coat, untouched, as if no one had dared approach her after the deed. The only disturbance in the fresh dusting of snow was her own faint trail of steps, leading from the main road. Just beside them, another set of footprints, larger, heavier, belonging to a man, followed for a short distance before vanishing into the deeper darkness of the alley. When officers arrived, summoned by the shaken watchman, they were baffled. The area had been quiet all evening, and not a single person had reported hearing anything unusual. No scream, no cry for help, no hurried footsteps fading into the night. The young woman, later identified as a seamstress who lived only a few blocks away, had seemingly been strangled in the heart of the city without anyone noticing. The police were reluctant to alarm the public. They catalogued the scene with hushed voices, their boots crunching in the frost, their lanterns sweeping over cold bricks that revealed nothing. No valuables missing, no obvious motive. Just silence. But for some of the men who had been long enough in Chicago's underbelly, this discovery stirred an unease that they struggled to put into words. For this was not the first time. In the past several months, 2 other women had been found under similar circumstances. Both strangled, both discovered long after their deaths, their faces eerily calm, their belongings untouched. At the time, each had been explained away as isolated tragedies, perhaps crimes of passion or robberies gone wrong. But now, the pattern was too stark to ignore. By morning, whispers began to circulate. The newspapers had not yet caught wind of the killing, but inside boarding houses and factories, in taverns and market stalls, people spoke of a figure who could creep through the city without sound, a man who killed without leaving a trace of struggle. Some called him a phantom. Others simply said, the Strangler. The truth was far more chilling. A killer walked among them, blending into the crowded streets, slipping past neighbors and watchmen alike. He left no trace but the silence of his victims, each taken without warning, each snuffed out as though the city itself had swallowed them whole. As the young woman's body was carried away into the frozen night, one question lingered heavily in the air, unanswered then, and haunting still today. Who was the man behind this string of deaths? And how could he kill in the very heart of Chicago, without anyone hearing a sound? The first whispers of terror began quietly, almost dismissed at first as coincidence. A young woman named Clara Winslow, 22 years old, was found dead in the spring of 1898, long before the winter discovery that would finally force the city to pay attention. Clara had been a seamstress working long hours in a garment factory near Halsted Street. When she did not return to her boarding house one evening, her roommates assumed she had stayed late at the shop. By morning, her body was discovered behind a row of warehouses. She had been strangled, her modest coin purse still tucked beneath her coat. The police chalked it up to a robbery interrupted or perhaps a violent suitor. Chicago was no stranger to crime, and one death tragic though it did not stir citywide alarm. But then another woman turned up. Her name was Margaret Doyle, a 30-year-old widow who worked as a laundress. She was found slumped in the stairwell of her boarding house, a scarf knotted cruelly around her throat. Again, there was no theft, no signs of forced entry, no sounds of a struggle. Her neighbors had slept only a few feet away, yet no one had heard her final moments. By the time the third body appeared, the young seamstress near Clark Street in that bitter winter of 1899, a pattern was undeniable. Women alone. No robbery. No witnesses, and always the silence. The newspapers seized on the mystery. In bold type, the Chicago Tribune declared, "Phantom killer stalks the street, silent strangler claims another victim." Reporters relished the eerie details, the intact belongings, the lack of sound, the way the killer seemed to slip away into the night unseen. The moniker stuck. Chicago now lived in fear of the Silent Strangler. The killings soon escalated. In the summer of 1899, Anna Zielinski, a 19-year-old Polish immigrant, vanished after leaving her job at a bakery. Days later, her body was found near the river docks, carefully laid out as though placed there with deliberate calm. She had been learning English at a night school, her books still tucked in her satchel. Her family, newly arrived from Europe, wept openly in the police station, begging for answers that the authorities did not have. Each victim added a layer to the growing dread. A school teacher walking home after grading papers, a boarding housemaid who had been saving money to reunite with her family in St. Louis, a nurse's assistant who had just finished a long shift at the county hospital. Their lives, modest but full of hope, were cut off suddenly, and in each case neighbors insisted they heard nothing at all. No screams, no scuffle, just silence until the discovery of a body hours later. Women began carrying pocket knives and walking in groups whenever possible. Boarding house matrons instructed tenants to bolt doors and windows early, though it seemed to do little good. Stories circulated of the strangler slipping inside buildings without a sound, leaving no mark of forced entry. Some believed he used skeleton keys, others thought he climbed through windows. A few even whispered that he could appear and vanish like a ghost. The police, under mounting pressure, increased night patrols and placed plainclothes detectives near boarding houses. But still, the murders came. The strangler's ability to strike unseen in a crowded city, no less, left both the public and authorities unsettled. By late 1899, fear had spread beyond the working-class neighborhoods. Even families in wealthier districts along Dearborn and Wabash began to worry. For the strangler did not seem to follow boundaries of class or community. His victims were united not by wealth or status, but by vulnerable women alone, their voices stolen before they could call for help. The chilling escalation reached a new height when, for the first time, the killer struck inside a locked room. A young schoolteacher named Ellen Burke was discovered lifeless in her bed, the door to her room still bolted from the inside. Her housemates swore they had heard nothing. How the killer entered and how he left remained a riddle. That was the moment when terror became hysteria. If the strangler could breach locked doors, nowhere was safe. Chicago had faced murderers before, but never one who seemed to move like a shadow through the very fabric of the city, striking unseen and unheard. And though the silent strangler had grown bolder, the city had not yet seen the full extent of his cruelty. The worst was still to come. To understand the fear that would soon spread through Chicago, we must first step back and look at the city as it stood at the turn of the century. The year was 1899. Chicago was a city of contradictions, dazzling in its opportunities, yet dangerous in its shadows. It had been barely 3 decades since the Great Fire of 1871, and in that short span, the city had risen from ashes into a metropolis of over 1.5 million people. Immigrants poured in daily from Germany, Ireland, Poland, and Italy, while African-American families from the South arrived in search of better lives. The skyline was transforming with steel and stone. Factories roared day and night, and streetcars rattled endlessly across the frozen avenues. But beneath the promise of modernity lay a harsher reality. The industrial boom had carved out deep social divides. Wealthy merchants dined in gaslit restaurants along Michigan Avenue, while only blocks away overcrowded boarding houses stank of coal smoke, sweat, and poverty. The air itself was heavy with soot from the endless smokestacks, and in winter the bitter wind off Lake Michigan cut through layers of wool and leather like knives. For working women, in particular seamstresses, laundresses, and factory hands, survival meant long hours and dangerous journeys home after dark. It was in these streets, teeming with life but shadowed by desperation, that women became easy prey for someone like Lucius Brant. Little was known about Brant in those days, and perhaps that was part of what made him so invisible. To neighbors in his boarding house, he was a quiet, solitary man in his late 30s who worked irregular hours. He told some he was employed as a repairman for the telegraph company, a trade that allowed him to slip in and out of buildings with little question. Others believed he sometimes worked as a carpenter, patching floors and stairwells in the older brick buildings scattered throughout the city. Always soft-spoken, always polite, he blended in without effort. Yet beneath that surface was a man shaped by hardship and silence. Brant had been born in rural Illinois, the son of a stern farmer who raised him with an iron hand. His mother died when he was still young, and locals would later recall that the boy often wandered the woods alone, avoiding the company of other children. Teachers remembered him as bright, though unsettlingly quiet, with a tendency to stare at nothing in particular as though lost in thoughts no one else could share. By his teenage years, troubling rumors had begun to spread in the farming community. Small animals, cats, dogs, even livestock had a habit of disappearing when Brant was nearby. Neighbors whispered but never confronted him directly. After all, in those times, a poor farming family had little interest in stirring scandal. When Brant eventually left for Chicago in his early 20s, the countryside breathed a collective sigh of relief, though no one then could have imagined what path he would eventually walk. Chicago's police force at the end of the 19th century was ill-prepared for what awaited them. Detectives had begun experimenting with rudimentary investigative methods, but fingerprinting had not yet become standard practice, and crime scene science was virtually non-existent. Investigations often relied on shoe prints, eyewitness accounts, and rumor. In a city of over 1 million with thousands of boarding houses, taverns, and alleyways, the task of finding a single predator was daunting. That was the world Lucius Brant stepped into, a city vast enough to hide him, chaotic enough to cover his movements, and vulnerable enough to provide victims who walked alone in the dark. For him, Chicago was not just a place to live. It was a hunting ground. What no one realized as they hurried past one another in the cold, as women clutched shawls tighter and men hunched against the wind, was that Lucius Brant had already begun choosing his victims. The murders that unsettled the city in whispers were only the beginning. The Silent Strangler was about to escalate, and soon Chicago would no longer be able to ignore the phantom moving in its streets. And as the century turned, the city would learn that silence itself could be deadly. By the turn of the century, fear in Chicago had reached a fever pitch. For nearly 2 years, women had been strangled in alleys, stairwells, and even their own locked rooms. The killer had become a phantom in the public imagination, everywhere and nowhere, striking without sound. The police force, already strained by rampant robberies, political corruption, and gang violence, now faced a predator whose very method defied explanation. Detectives pored over the Strangler's crimes, looking for patterns. They found that all of the victims lived in boarding houses or walked routes through neighborhoods with narrow alleys and poor lighting. The attacks happened at night, usually late when the streets were empty and watchmen drowsy at their posts. And yet, even with these patterns, the Strangler seemed always one step ahead. The public's patience wore thin. Newspapers lambasted the police as incompetent, describing their nightly patrols as lanterns chasing shadows. Some editorials even suggested the killer must be a policeman himself. So perfect was his ability to vanish without notice. Vigilante groups formed in immigrant neighborhoods, patrolling with clubs and lanterns. Innocent men were accosted in the streets simply for walking alone after dark. Within the police department, one man refused to let the case fade into rumor. Detective Sergeant Henry Mallory, a veteran of the force, became obsessed with the Strangler. Mallory was not a man of flair or reputation. He was steady, methodical, and patient. He studied each crime scene, sketched footprints in the snow, and tracked where each victim had last been seen. While others speculated about ghosts and hypnotists, Mallory focused on the tangible: roots, timing, silence. Then came the first break in the case. In late winter of 1900, a young woman named Lillian Moore was attacked inside her boarding house room. Unlike the others, she survived. As she later told police, she had been reading by lamplight when she felt a shift in the air behind her, as though someone had entered the room without opening the door. A pair of hands wrapped around her throat, pressing down with a terrifying calm, but in the struggle, she managed to twist free just long enough to rake her fingernails across the attacker's face. The man fled into the night, leaving her gasping for breath but alive. Her description was chilling. He was tall, gaunt, with pale eyes that seemed almost glassy in the lamplight. He moved with a deliberate stillness as though his very body resisted making sound, and on his face she had left scratches deep enough to draw blood. Mallory seized on this lead. He scoured boarding houses in the districts where the Strangler had struck. Days later, he found a man who fit the description. Lucius Brant, a telegraph repairman living quietly in a small rented room on South Clark Street. When Mallory knocked on the door, Brant opened it calmly. Across his cheek ran fresh red welts, hidden poorly beneath a week-old stubble. Inside his room, Mallory found a chilling assortment. Scarves and strips of cloth folded neatly in a drawer, a set of workman's gloves worn smooth from use, and a small box containing skeleton keys, the very kind used to open simple boarding house locks. To Mallory, it was the final piece of the puzzle. Brant was arrested on the spot. He did not resist. He did not speak. As officers led him away, neighbors crowded the stairwell, whispering in disbelief. Some swore they had lived beside him for months and had barely heard his voice. Others muttered that they had always felt a strange unease in his presence, a quietness too deliberate to be natural. Back at the precinct, the questioning began. But Lucius Brant remained silent. No protest, no denial, not even curiosity. He simply sat, pale eyes fixed ahead as if the questions were being asked to someone else entirely. His silence unnerved even the most hardened officers. It was as though the city had been right all along. The Silent Strangler was more ghost than man. Still, the evidence was enough to hold him. The survivor's testimony, the scratches on his face, the scarves and skeleton keys, all painted a picture the public would soon hear in detail. For the first time, Chicago breathed a sigh of relief. The phantom had a face, but if Lucius Brant's silence during his crimes was terrifying, his silence after capture was even more haunting, for he would carry that silence all the way to the gallows. The arrest of Lucius Brant brought both relief and unease. For the first time in nearly 2 years, the city of Chicago could walk its streets with the faint hope that the phantom who had haunted their nights was behind bars. Women returned cautiously to their evening shifts, and boarding house matrons loosened their curfews. Yet something remained unsettled. Brant, even in custody, refused to speak. Not a word of confession, not a plea of innocence, seemingly silence. When his trial began in the spring of 1900, the Cook County Courthouse was overwhelmed with spectators. The building itself, with its imposing stone facade and echoing chambers, seemed to groan under the weight of expectation. Reporters filled the benches, their pencils scratching furiously, eager to capture every detail of the man the city had come to know as the Silent Strangler. Women packed the galleries, many widows or working girls who had lived in constant fear during the height of his killings. The atmosphere was not merely that of a trial, it was a public reckoning. The prosecution laid out its case piece by piece. They presented the survivor, Lillian Moore, who bravely took the stand and pointed to Brant as the man who had tried to end her life. Her voice shook as she recounted the icy calm in his eyes, the strength of his grip, and the desperate act of clawing at his face to break free. The jury leaned in as she told them, "I saw no anger in him, no passion, only stillness." Investigators then testified to the items found in Brant's room, the scarves, the skeleton keys, the gloves. They argued that these were not tools of a workman but of a predator, who prepared meticulously for each silent strike. Witnesses from his boarding house described his solitary habits, his tendency to vanish at odd hours, and the unsettling quiet that seemed to follow him. The defense, weak and scrambling, argued that the evidence was circumstantial. They suggested that the scratches on Brant's face might have come from an accident, that the scarves and keys were merely the possessions of a laborer accustomed to odd jobs. And still through it all, Lucius Brant sat motionless, his pale eyes staring blankly ahead. The silence unnerved everyone. Court reporters described it as the most dreadful quiet ever carried into a courtroom. Jurors whispered of how they expected him at some moment to rise and proclaim his innocence or guilt. But Brant never did. Not a word escaped his lips. When the verdict came, it was swift. Guilty of multiple counts of murder. The sentence, death by hanging at Joliet Prison. Outside the courthouse, a crowd erupted in cheers and sobs. Some waved newspapers in triumph. Others prayed for the souls of the dead. For many, it was not justice alone, but a release from the grip of terror that had strangled the city, as surely as Brant had strangled his victims. On the morning of his execution, in October of 1900, the prison yard was gray with fog. A small group of officials and witnesses gathered to see the end of the Silent Strangler. Brant walked to the gallows with the same unnerving calm that had marked his trial. His hands were steady, his step measured. When asked for final words, he gave none. The silence lingered, stretching across the yard until it seemed unbearable. Only when the trap was sprung did the quiet break, a single sound, final and irreversible. In the weeks that followed, Chicago reflected on what it had endured. Editorials in the Tribune and the Times-Herald demanded stronger policing, better night patrols, and more secure housing for women. Some reformers used Brant's case to argue for the modernization of criminal investigations, pointing out that, had fingerprinting and better forensic methods been in place, he might have been caught sooner. For ordinary people, the killings left scars of a different kind. Families kept their doors bolted tighter, and women carried their fear of the night long after Brant's body had been buried. The Silent Strangler faded into the annals of Chicago's grim history, but his legacy lingered. He was a man who had lived in shadows, killed without sound, and carried his silence to the very end. Even in death, Lucius Brant offered no explanation, no glimpse into the mind that had terrorized a city. And so the questions remain. Was his silence defiance, a final cruelty to deny his victims' families answers? Or was it the truest reflection of who he was? A man who found power in quiet, who let silence speak louder than words. More than a century later, the echo of that silence still chills the imagination. Chicago has faced many horrors in its long history, but few so haunting as the man who killed without a sound. Lucius Brant, the Silent Strangler of Chicago, left behind no words, only a silence that history itself has never been able to fill.